Welcome. We're glad that you're able to join us for the free speech industry. This event is hosted by the Center for Information Technology and Public Life at the University of North Carolina, part of our spring speaker series. I'm Catherine Peters, CTAP's Executive Director. CTAP is dedicated to understanding the growing impact of the internet, social media, and other forms of digital communication in the context of the people who design, use, and govern them. We're especially interested in people, platforms, and power. Our research takes a holistic approach to studying technology that focuses on how social inequality and power structures shape the use, deployment, and impact of technologies. We're committed to equality and justice in our scholarship, teaching, and dissemination research. In that spirit, I'd like for us to take a moment to consider the legacy of colonization in our technology system society. Our center occupies the ancestral land of the Shipori, Eno, Tuscarora, and Lumbee peoples, and it remains home today to the Okinachi band of Sigourney Nation. The university was founded in its early years. I invite you to join us in acknowledging our shared responsibility. Today, we're honored to host Dr. Marianne Franks. After her talk, we'll hold a Q&A session. For those of you joining us remotely, you can submit questions via email to ctap@unc.edu. To introduce our speaker, I'll hand the microphone over to my colleague, Dr. Shannon McGregor, assistant professor here in the Hussman School of Journalism and Media and a senior researcher here at CTAP.
Thank you, everyone, so much for joining us here in person and on the live stream as well. I'm really, really pleased to welcome Dr. Marianne Franks to give the inaugural talk in our CTAP Spring Speaker Series. Dr. Franks is a professor of law and the Michael R. Klein Distinguished Scholar Chair at the University of Miami. She's the author of the award-winning book, The Cult of the Constitution. Tori has a copy here. Our Deadly Devotion to Guns and Free Speech. In 2020, she was awarded a grant from the Knight Foundation to support research for her second book, Fearless Speech, which we are eagerly awaiting later this year. Her scholarship has appeared in the Harvard Law Review, the California Law Review, and UCLA Law Review, among others, and has authored numerous articles for popular press, including the New York Times, the Atlantic, the Washington Post, and Newsweek. He spoke earlier about our commitment to equity and inclusivity at CTAP, and Dr. Franks' work in support of digital rights and equity is vast. She is the president and legislative and tech policy director for the Cyber Civil Rights Initiative, a nonprofit organization dedicated to combating online abuse and discrimination. In 2013, she drafted the first model criminal statute on non-consensual pornography, aka revenge porn, which has served as the template for multiple state laws and pending federal legislation on the issue. Dr. Franks' groundbreaking thinking on the First Amendment and its intersection with technology has shaped not only our thinking at CTAP, but that of national and international scholarly communities, as well as those in the industry and regulators. She's sort of a regular testifying before Congress now about these issues. As part of her work as a Knight visiting scholar this year, Dr. Franks recently authored Beyond the Public Square, Imagining Digital Democracy, which was published as part of Yale ISP's white paper series, which is in collaboration with the Knight Foundation. And I just want to read one small quote from it, and then I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Franks. In it, she argues, if we want online spaces that do not merely replicate existing hierarchies and reinforce radically unequal distributions of social, economic, cultural, and political power, we must move beyond the simplistic and corrosive cliche of some unregulated public square and commit to the hard work of designing for democracy. Once we acknowledge that no truly inclusive, democratic, and free arena for public discourse has ever existed in the United States, either online or off, then we can move on and achieve all these things simultaneously. Instead of some idealized public square, we can envision the flourishing of multiple spaces, online and off, public and private, that provide the conditions necessary for free expression and democratic deliberation. And it is exactly this sort of groundbreaking thinking, positioning technology as embedded within cultural and political spaces, that makes Dr. Frank such a powerful and inspiring legal scholar, and just one of the many, many reasons that we are honored to have you join us here today. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Marianne Reese.
Thank you so much, Shannon and Katie. That was an incredibly generous introduction. I appreciate it so much. And I'm really thrilled to be here today to talk to you about, well, a lot of things that I've been thinking about lately, some of which were expressed in this piece that I've done fairly recently for Yale. But this broader question of what free speech actually means to most people. So not just the question of doctrine, but the question of what it actually means to Americans, to citizens of the world. What does it mean to engage in free speech? What does it mean for us to be censored? What does it mean for us to feel that we are not able to exercise this incredibly powerful and important value? So where I want to start is with a recent study, 2019 First Amendment Center of the Freedom Forum Institute survey, which found that a majority of the respondents, 65% of the respondents, believe that when social media companies ban users based on the content of their posts, they violate the First Amendment. So 65% of people responding to the survey, more than half, believe that when social media companies are not letting you say what you want to say, that is a violation of the First Amendment. Now, we might want to say, well, that's just a survey. That's just maybe there's some problem with the methodology here. But we also need to note that that's back in 2019, before some of the most controversial high-profile decisions were made by social media companies in terms of bans. In particular, the banning of President Donald Trump in the wake of the January 6th insurrection, which led to, on the part of some people, the celebration that this had finally happened, that this was something that was a long time coming, but it also led to an extraordinary amount of criticism. And a lot of that criticism came from political forces, but a lot of it came from across the political spectrum. You may recall that 2 days after the insurrection, Twitter permanently banned then President Donald Trump's personal account. And they gave as their reasons that there were public safety reasons for engaging in this, and that there had been a lead up to this decision where Trump was able to, if he had chosen to take down certain posts or to change his mind about some of the things he was posting on the platform. And we also know that in the insurrection itself, or that the plans for the insurrection as they had been coming to light, that they were organized extensively on social media platforms. And so it wasn't just a question of one person's role in possibly encouraging that insurrection, but also a lot of the planning that was taking place on social media platforms such as Facebook, Twitter, and Parler. So this decision that Twitter makes in January 2021 comes after Facebook had similarly announced that they were suspending Trump's account indefinitely. And then there were a wave of social media bans that followed. January 9th, Google and Apple removed the right-wing dominated social media site Parler from their app stores after the app refused to moderate violent content. And Amazon removed the site from its web hosting services later the same day, citing multiple violations of their terms of service. So predictably, this led to a lot of partisan outcry. Then Secretary of State Mike Pompeo tweeted, "Silencing speech is dangerous. It's un-American." Sadly, he went on to say, this isn't a new tactic of the left. They've worked to silence opposing voices for years. Donald Trump Jr. tweeted, "Free speech is under attack. Censorship is happening like never before. Don't let them silence us." Congressman Matt Gaetz proclaimed on Twitter, "We cannot live in a world where Twitter's terms of service are more important than the terms in our Constitution and our Bill of Rights." Many of the conservatives who were complaining about the decision to remove Trump and the decisions that were based around Parler were also complaining about how many Twitter followers they were losing in the wake of these decisions. Among these that were complaining, Sarah Huckabee Sanders, former White House press secretary, who tweeted that she had lost 50,000 followers this week and said, "The radical left and their big tech allies cannot marginalize, censor, or silence the American people. This is not China. This is the United States of America, and we are a free country. But it wasn't just criticism coming from the right. When these social media platforms announced these decisions, there were also other voices that emerged to criticize these choices. After Facebook announced its indefinite suspension of Trump's account, NSA whistleblower Edward Snowden tweeted, "Facebook officially silences the President of the United States. For better or for worse, this will be remembered as a turning point in the battle for control over digital speech." The Electronic Frontier Foundation observed that we are always concerned when platforms take on the role of censors. Senior Legislative Counsel for the ACLU wrote that it should concern everyone when companies like Facebook and Twitter wield the unchecked power to remove people from platforms that have become indispensable for the speech of billions. So across the political spectrum, outcry over these decisions that were being made. That swift social media crackdown following the events of the insurrection has demonstrated at a minimum two things. One is that technology companies have always had the power to engage in this type of removal, this type of moderation. They simply lack the will. And the backlash that this has inspired, again, across the political spectrum, is a testament to just how much what I would call the free speech industry, the tech industry, has colonized the free speech imagination of the American people, such that for many Americans, speech is only real if it appears somewhere online. Free speech is not merely a negative freedom from government interference, but an affirmative right to an audience and to amplification. And any moderation, editorial control, or enforcement of quality standards by social media companies will be treated as censorship. This, I would suggest, is a bad place for us to be. And it's a bad place for us to be for multiple reasons. The first reason is that this is completely inaccurate as a matter of First Amendment law. This perspective that social media companies owe an obligation to anyone to be able to use their platforms, this is simply wrong as a doctrinal matter, which those of you who have studied the First Amendment are well aware of. Because of what is known as the state action doctrine, which is not specific to the First Amendment, but applies more broadly for the rights enshrined in the Bill of Rights. These are rights as against the government. They're rights that say the government is restrained from prohibiting your freedom of speech, restrained from abridging your freedom of speech, the government. But even within that category, it's important to note that, of course, that's not an absolute rule. It may seem like it because that's how the First Amendment is written, but of course, in fact, there are multiple categories of speech that are not protected or fully protected by the First Amendment, and the government restrains and regulates a number of these kinds of speech, as well as things that it's a little bit maybe cagier about, as opposed to, let's say, categories of obscenity, fighting words, child pornography. There are also things like perjury, confidentiality rules more generally, anti-discrimination law, multiple forms of speech that the government is fully entitled to regulate. So that's a problem as a matter of state action doctrine. One of the other reasons why it matters that people are getting this wrong is that it actually diverts attention away from and resources away from actual government censorship. That is to say, when we say, look at what Twitter and Facebook are doing, isn't it shocking? We tend to pay less attention to the fact that the government, in many cases in our time, is literally suppressing speech with all of its power, right? Calling for certain subjects not to be taught in certain places, calling for book bans, calling for protest bills that will actually incredibly, that will have incredible limitations on the ability of people to exercise their First Amendment rights. So we divert attention away from those problems. And worse, sometimes it actually drives us to those problems. Bills that have been introduced in various states that attempt to allow the government to force social media companies to actually carry speech that they do not want to carry. What that does too is it tends to conflate freedom of speech with what Renee DeResta has called freedom of reach. The idea that it's not a negative right, that you have a right to an audience, an affirmative audience. The idea that it's not just that you should not be thrown in jail or otherwise punished for your speech, but that you have an affirmative right to a specific audience. That misunderstanding of the doctrine is deeply connected to a lack of appreciation, and in some cases, a hostility towards the kind of less recognized part of the First Amendment right for private individuals, which is the right not to speak. That is, when we are not talking about the government, when we're talking about private actors, including social media companies, we're talking about the right not to speak. Very famous cases on these points, the famous case involving the right of a person, of a student, to not recite the Pledge of Allegiance, for instance. The government can't compel you to say things that you don't want to say, by and large. Closely connected to that is the right of private businesses, private property owners to exclude people from their grounds, to say we don't want you here, especially if you are violating some kind of terms, conditions, or expectations that we have on this space. Limited, of course, by discrimination law or anti-discrimination law, but there is a very broad right on the part of private companies, parties, to exclude people from their services, from their premises. But I would say, in addition to all of these problems, all of which are troubling, it also illustrates the degree to which free speech has become a commodity. That when we think about social media, when we think about our right to freedom of speech, we think, do I have the right to say this on Twitter? Do I have the right to say this on Facebook? Instead of thinking more broadly about what the exercise of freedom of speech might be. Here we have this idea that if what we are really saying is important, and the test of whether or not we're able to speak freely is whether or not Twitter will let us do so, that we stop and think about what that actually means. Twitter is a corporation. All of these companies that control the major social media platforms are corporations. They are not public citizens. Their vested interest is in their bottom line. Their vested interest is actually in exploiting the free labor of everyone who decides to create the speech that the industry then profits from. Take your speech, trade it off with someone else's speech, get all the kinds of information we can about you so we can sell it to advertisers or to data brokers. This is a clear case where you've got corporate interests in your speech, not because they're interested in the civic virtue or the value of your speech, but because we want to make money. Of all the kinds of structures and values that we might want a free speech community or platform to have, this seems like a very, very bad one. Now, how does this happen? We tend to start thinking of, not just us, when I say we've also been told this by companies themselves, we've been told this by courts, that the internet is the public square, right? That this is where people really can be free. And we really need to think about the analogies here, because at least in terms of the powerful social mechanism of the public square, theorists, Habermas, on have said, the public square is important because it's a space that is free of government domination, for one. It is a space that is free of corporate domination, is another. If we were imagining the internet as a physical space, it would be a physical space that would have signs everywhere that says private property. This is not a public square. This is not the park. This is not a speaker's corner. It belongs to someone. And that someone actually does have rules and regulations always. Before we're talking about banning someone after an insurrection, always has rules and regulations about what you're allowed to do there. And if you're not profiting for the company, you are probably not going to be able to use the service, at least not in an optimal sense. So why is that a problem? Well, in part because that's a very limited way of thinking about our freedom of speech. The incentives here are not aligned. The incentives here are also designed to make us think that our speech is only real, only important, to the extent that it can be monetized and performed on social media platforms. Such that we'd even have to stop ourselves and ask, what does it mean to speak freely if not online? Right? When we think back to the last time we've spoken freely in a way that is meaningful and connected to those values that we think the First Amendment serves, truth, autonomy, democracy, can we think beyond the social media aspect of it? Do we think about how we speak in classrooms, how we might speak in a town hall, how we might speak to our family members, how we might speak when we are gathering with our friends? We might think of all the ways in which, of course, free speech is not dependent on, or needs to be shaped by, the corporate platform that we are speaking on. And why don't we think, too, about how much that labor really costs us? That is, that the very machinery of social media companies is the speech that individuals use, and that we give away this labor for free. And we do this in part because we are also told that we're getting something for free. We're allowed to communicate with each other. We are getting free speech in return. It's free in 2 senses. True freedom of speech, these companies try to say, that's what you're doing here. This is unfettered, true marketplace of ideas, and you don't have to pay for it. That's how it works. That's how we convince people that what's happening is not just some sort of performance within a corporate space, but actually that this is really what true communication looks like. This is what true freedom looks like, and we know that it's free because it's free. Now, there's been a lot that has come to light in the last few years that have shown just how little is actually free on the internet. As the old saying goes, if you're not paying for the product, you are the product. It's not as though Facebook is interested in connecting people just for the sake of connecting people. They connect people because it reveals things about you. Your speech reveals things about you, and those things are extremely profitable. And that is the reason for having these communities, not some noble principle by which we are trying to become more democratic through Mark Zuckerberg's vision. But how did we get here? How is it that if that is true, it's so hard for people to speak, right? The majority of respondents in the survey, so many high-profile politicians, civil libertarians, our feelings about this. Of course, this is about free speech. I suggest there's a couple of reasons for why this has happened. One of them is that feeling, right? It feels free. It feels as though this is incredibly important. It feels like the currency that we now use to communicate with each other. Can I say it on Facebook? Can I say it on Twitter? So we have a passionate attachment to free speech in a way that makes us think that we have intuitions that are correct about this. If it feels like we're engaging in free speech, then we must be in fact engaging in free speech. So it feels right. That's part of it. And now that we have lived for such a long time, even before the pandemic, such a long time, we have lived in a world that is so dependent on social media platforms and dependent on the internet more broadly, it is really hard to think outside of the internet. It's quite literally hard to think outside of it. We are now depending on social media for communication, for news, for commerce, for education, for entertainment, so that we are living fully online. Any restriction of how we live that life online will start to feel like a matter of constitutional significance. It feels like a very big deal. Now, most people know on some level that probably it is the case that social media platforms don't owe us something the way the government owes us something when it comes to speech. Most people know that if you don't let somebody inside your house, that's not censoring that person who's not coming inside your house. Most people understand that when a restaurant has a sign that says we reserve the right to remove guests, right, or to refuse service to anyone, most people understand that's not censorship either. We mostly understand that your constitutional rights aren't violated when your letter to the editor gets rejected by the Wall Street Journal. Speaking personally. But there is something about the internet that makes people feel differently about this. And it has a lot to do with the sense of this is where we live, this is where we communicate, this is where we are seen. But I would suggest that our intuitions and our feelings about social media and the fact that social media has become such a dominant force does not happen by accident, but by design. And it happens by design with the collaboration of multiple actors, including the tech industry itself, probably most powerfully the tech industry itself. So when we think of how did people get this idea, this complete myth, right, that online platforms are somehow natural, that they are essential, that they're unmediated in some ways. When we think about how that could have been created in our minds, we have to think about the way the tech industry described itself and promoted itself for so long. Think about everything that happens, especially let's say in the 90s, when we're starting to get our theories out there about this is the new internet, this is the new radical utopia of communication. Journalist Nicholas Thompson has said the idea of free speech has long been a central concern in Silicon Valley, from the hacker ethic that prized the free flow of information to a Twitter executive's infamous 2012 characterization of the site as the free speech wing of the Free Speech Party. You think too about the very elaborate, passionate manifesto that we see in 1996 that is penned by John Perry Barlow, the founder or one of the founders of the Electronic Frontier Foundation, 1996 Declaration of the Independence of Cyberspace, where he says, we are creating a world where anyone, anywhere may express his or her beliefs, no matter how singular, without fear of being coerced into silence or conformity. That's a manifesto that characterized any interference with that space, any kind of governmental interference in that space, as censorship. All the sentiments and expressions of humanity, he says, from the debasing to the angelic, are parts of a seamless whole, a global conversation of bits. We cannot separate the air that chokes from the air upon which wings beat. So this very entrenched idea that the internet is free speech, it is where free speech truly lives. Querying whether John Perry Barlow up until 1996 had not been able to speak freely, that he would so need to champion this idea, well, finally, white men like me can speak freely. Where is that sense of revolution coming from? Who are we worried about at this particular moment that needs this new space? To think of it this way, so that people can finally be free. So we have that background that just permeates so much of the internet, the colonization of the internet, and especially of the social media platforms that then become increasingly commercialized. And then we know too, if we look at the history of how most of the big companies that dominate today are dominated by a certain type A person, right? The tech industry is overwhelmingly white, overwhelmingly male still, and overwhelmingly American. And the American part of this that seems to matter a lot is this idea that free speech is somehow this First Amendment, this Bowdler-Hyde version of the First Amendment, which is let everything in is the default presumption. You love free speech, let everything in. And if you intervene, you're a censor, and you better have a really good reason for doing it. Importing that kind of sloppy idea, sloppy understanding of the First Amendment into the way that they structure their platforms. So if you look to at highlights of moments where these platforms are called to account, because the extraordinary thing about the backlash against social media companies finally doing something about harassment, misinformation, these types of abuses, is how long these companies got away with doing nothing at all. And that every time someone would appeal to them, there would be an appeal to say, why don't you do something about non-consensual pornography? Why don't you do something about harassment campaigns? Why don't you do something about Gamergate? And the answer was free speech. We don't want to be censors. We can't intervene. We just have to let it happen, right? 2012, subreddit that features surreptitious photographs of underage girls. CEO of Reddit at the time, Michelle Long, wrote, "We stand for free speech." This means we are not going to ban distasteful subreddits. We will not ban legal content, even if we find it odious, or if we personally condemn it. And this is the argument of this is the virtuous position. This is what it means to be committed to free speech, is to be passive in the face of speech that silences and harms vulnerable communities. The creator of the site 8chan, Frederick Brennan, asked in 2014 whether sexually explicit imagery featuring minors was just an inevitable fixture of sites like his. And he said, it's simply the cost of free speech that we have to have this type of material. More recently, have sites that are explicitly trying to promote themselves as the true free speech sites, things like Gab and Parler and Getter, and these terms of service are invoking the First Amendment explicitly in their terms of service over and over again to say, we are inspired by the principles of the First Amendment. We are going to take on the spirit of the First Amendment so that we will not intervene against speech that people want. Note too that all of these companies, in fact, censor all kinds of speech. If we're going to use that word, if what we mean by censor is you take down content or you don't allow content that you find problematic for your site, every single one has rules about spam. Every single one has rules about porn, whether pro or negative. Every single one has got several statements about the kinds of things, the kinds of behavior you cannot engage in on their platforms. Every one of them has rules. And say at the same time, we are the place, we are the home of free speech. So the industry itself goes a very long way in pushing the propaganda that the free speech industry, that the tech industry is the free speech industry. But they had help. Because if you look the same year, when John Perry Barlow writes his manifesto, you look at the legislation that was passed by Congress, the part of the Communications Decency Act that actually survives constitutional challenge, the infamous Section 230, and you look at the findings and the justification for why Section 230 is going to do what it's going to do. And what it does, just to be clear, is it essentially provides immunity for social media platforms and other internet companies, provides them immunity from civil suit for anything effectively that is said or done on their platforms. There's a few exceptions, but it's pretty broad. There's another part of Section 230 that says you're also protected from lawsuits if you take stuff down. And it's really important to understand the two different parts of Section 230. One is you are not going to get into trouble for anything you leave up. The other part is you're not going to get into trouble for anything you take down. In some ways, that makes that second part somewhat duplicative because, as we discussed, the First Amendment gives you that right. Of course, you can take stuff down. It's your site. But that first one, that's really extraordinary. Try to think of another industry where you are preemptively, I should say, immunized from legal challenge, any kind of civil lawsuit, even if you contributed to the harm of this, even if you produce a faulty product, even if there's a pretty direct connection between your indifference and somebody dying. Try to imagine how many industries get that kind of preemptive immunity, and why do they get it? Well, if you look at the findings of Section 230, Congress says, well, this is speech. Right? The findings actually echo John Perry Barlow pretty clearly and say we are doing this because the internet is clearly where free speech is going to live. It's clearly to the benefit of all Americans that we have a minimum of government regulation. It actually says that. Makes an empirical statement without any empirical evidence to say things are working out so well. Let's see what happens. So you've got the tech industry say we are free speech. You've got Congress saying they are free speech. And then you get courts saying yes. And it's not just in a limited sense that you could read Section 230, which is to say, okay, so you don't have publisher liability. You're not liable as though you are the speaker of the content you have on your platforms. But goes even farther in certain courts to say you're not even the distributor of it. You basically have no liability. So the chance that there might have been to read Section 230 narrowly gets kicked out by the courts themselves, who say, hey, we actually think it's very, very broad. Basically immunized for all content when it comes to civil lawsuits. And then you got the Supreme Court stepping in and saying in a case called Hackingham and in other places, the internet is the modern public square. The Supreme Court, which is, we should know what they're talking about, right? And if they're saying it's the modern public square, what do they mean? They mean that we're going to treat this like a government entity so that people can never be excluded on the basis of the content of their views. I think that it suggests that indeed. All of which is to say, that's how far we go before we are brought back to reality. For instance, 2018, one of the many times that Mark Zuckerberg gets called before Congress to answer some questions, he is asked when he is testifying before the Senate Judiciary and Senate Commerce, Science, and Transportation Committees, he is asked by Senator Orrin Hatch, how do you sustain a business model in which users don't pay for their service? And Zuckerberg says, Senator, we run ads. This is not a free speech platform. This is not a public park. This is a company that is trying to make money. How much money? Let's see, August 2021, Google, Apple, Microsoft reported record-breaking quarterly sales and profits. Facebook doubled its profits and reported its fastest growth in 5 years. In the last 3 months alone, at the time that was written, US's 5 largest tech companies made combined profits of over $68 billion. 2005, only 5% of Americans reported using social media. Today, that number is 72%. 7 in 10 Facebook users report daily use of the platform. That may be starting to change, but this was true as of last year. The internet today is dominated, as many people will point out, by multi-billion-dollar companies. The point of these companies is to optimize what is euphemistically called engagement. That is to say, we want people to interact with the content. What does that actually mean when you think about it in practice? These industry players are commercial enterprises that are looking to find ways to get people to say more and say more provocatively so that we can find out more about you individually, so that we can target you for advertising, but also so that other people will engage with you more. And what does it turn out that people really like to engage with? Really polarizing, really extreme, really provocative content. So that's where all the money goes. So what do you've got free speech as free labor, right? You don't even have to pay people to do this. Facebook doesn't create anything. Twitter doesn't create anything. Individuals create those things and create them for free. They amplify these companies. They sort, they sell the speech of users. Such a good name for what it is that we all are when we're using these kinds of platforms. We're users who increasingly seem to not be able to conceptualize a right of free speech that is not part, that exists apart from the internet. The tech industry is masking corporate manipulation, its extraction of data, its exploitation of speech to an increasingly wide range of free services that we just cannot live without. And then you think about what it means when they decide to take that away from you. Of course, that feels like a violation of constitutional magnitude. So how does it happen? You get a merging, you could say, one way of summarizing all of this is that you get a merging of economic libertarianism along with civil libertarianism. They just join together. Even in that favorite metaphor that we were given about freedom of speech, the marketplace of ideas, because speech is a commodity. It is something that can be consumed. It is something that can be sold, monetized. It is something that we now have to think maybe on a variation of that old question of a tree falling in the forest, does it make a sound? If you have a thought and you don't post it on social media, did you have it? Free speech exists if not for the performativity on a social media site. That is how far we've gone to be colonized in our thoughts and our imagination when it comes to freedom of speech. Well, if you think about that as their model, if you think about how it is that companies are able to get the very thing they would need that they can't create themselves, the thing that they would need to get from individuals, get it for free, be able to turn it for a profit. What does that mean to say that we are now wanting more from those companies, right? That we want them to produce more, that we want them to give us more access, that we want to resist their urges or their gestures towards taking a more hardline approach with their own moderation. That is to say, criticize them as soon as they do, in fact, start eliminating certain users, start making judgments about certain content. Do we really think that if we're going back to the idealized version of what we would hear from the Barlow, from the tech industry, Silicon Valley idealists, is this really free speech untamed? Is this really just what people would really say if they weren't afraid? Or is it very much corporate driven, corporate produced, corporate incentives of what is good speech? And doesn't that have real costs for the free speech of other people? That is, someone's going to have to lose, right? If every kind of speech, or let's say the underlying incentives of the kind of speech that plays well on social media is provocative, it's insulting, it's privacy invading, it is exploitative, then what does that actually do for free speech overall? We know, based on empirical evidence, what that does. When there are no regulations in place to stop someone from engaging in misinformation, or stop them engaging in non-consensual pornography, or to stop them from engaging in harassment campaigns, we know who goes silent, the targets of that speech, because nothing is going to help them. If you have to worry that the thing you're going to say that someone won't like will not just result in someone calling you a name or saying they don't like you, but might actually mean that your personal information gets posted online, that your home address becomes public knowledge, that someone might actually show up and hurt you. How can we say that that's actually speech? So where does that leave us? This notion of free speech, this corporate commoditized version of speech, you get something that absolutely does generate enormous capital. Capital both in the sense of literal sense of capital, but also symbolic capital. That's true enough. But who is actually getting to benefit from it? Who reaps the rewards of that system of hands off, we're going to let everything and everything being, every possible terrible thing we could possibly think of, we are going to let stay up, and everything else, our attempts to moderate or to choose or to have quality standards will be blasted as censorship. What are we going to end up with? And I suggest that the solution for that, if we are disturbed by this, if we're disturbed by how much our notions of free speech are being channeled, are being structured and being built according to corporate interests, I suggest that the solution is not what some, I would say, partisan players in all of this would say is the solution. It's not to then say, oh, we don't like what you're doing here with speech, therefore we're going to force you to carry more speech. It's actually to go in the other direction and say, we're going to support you in your role of taking down speech so that people are not silenced by the kinds of things that can happen on social media. But that's obviously not enough, right? If we really want to think about escaping the commoditization, the capitalization of freedom of speech, we have to get a little more, in some ways, historical. We have to have an old conversation about seizing the means of production. If this is the labor that is being exploited, we need to take it back. It doesn't need to be Facebook or Twitter or any of these platforms that decide what it means to have free speech. There can be a reinvestment, reallocation of our resources into all the spaces that are not dominated by corporate interests. that are not dominated by some sort of partisan concerns. What do those look like? Well, they look like lots of things. Universities, for one. They look like libraries. They look like hair salons. They look like town halls. They look like actual moments where people feel that there are standards in place and some sort of minimal agreed upon norms in place so that people can have a real conversation that is meaningful and substantial. That will, in fact, emphasize the values we claim to care about: truth, democracy, autonomy. So that is one way of thinking that we need to extricate ourselves from the industry and think about what it means to exercise freedom of speech beyond the online space. So that we not think about free speech as belonging to what we can say, what we can do in one of these platforms, but as mentioned before, that we could have the flourishing of multiple spaces. Lots of spaces that are consciously, thoughtfully, and reflectively trying to think about the conditions people need in order to speak freely. Because sometimes those conditions will be keep some people out. Sometimes those conditions will be intervene when someone is being subordinated or exploited or harassed. Think about law and policy that actually will try to ensure that no one host, no one forum, or even one medium would dominate the shaping of public opinion or the boundaries of free speech. That's going to mean, on some level, Section 230 reform. It's probably also going to mean antitrust reform, but it's also going to mean reimagination, contemplating meaningful investments in traditional media, public education, universities, community centers, and small businesses to return to or become alternate sites of expression, informed debate. The democratic society should demand myriad possibilities of free speech culture and not settle for the constraints of free speech.
Thank you so much. And I'll let you stay up there. We have some time for questions. I think, Katie, are you monitoring our sort of email? And I will
Yes.
turn to you in that.
Give the email address once more.
Yes, the email address once more is citap@unc.edu. If you are watching up there in the internet world and have a question, you can email us there as well. And we'll start with a couple here. Thank you again so much. I have like a million thoughts I'm excited to talk about later, but I have too many thoughts, so I'll turn it over to you. Yeah, we'll start with Alice.
Hi, Alice Marwick, CTAP. Hi, Marianne. Frank. It's so nice to see you again. It's been a while. I really enjoyed your talk. This is super provocative. So one of the things I was thinking about, and I'm hoping you can kind of help me think through this while you were speaking, is the fact that the internet is not social media platforms, right? Like that's practically what it looks like for a lot of people, but the internet itself is a network of, wires and cables and servers and computers. And more we're seeing that even that network is getting regulated by private interests. So when, if I'm like a sex worker and I want to put up a website for myself, then it's quite likely that I won't be able to get a credit card processor to work with me, or like PayPal won't work with me, Venmo won't work with me, things like that. There's certain sites, not sites that I like necessarily, but sites that have been taken down by Amazon Web Services, or they've been taken down by other hosting companies. And so there's not even the ability to have like a basic website you can host on the internet. And to me, I see that as like a somewhat different issue. I'm not convinced that's a free speech issue either. Like I generally buy your argument, like I agree with it, but I do think that feels different to me because it's about a internet where the infrastructure is private. Right, or as opposed to public infrastructure, like you're talking about with like a library or a park or something like that. How do we begin to think through these issues in parts of the internet that aren't social platforms?
Terrific question. And I think I have a very unsatisfying answer because I think this is part of what I think through as well, which is you're absolutely right. As a descriptive matter, our conversation around this is dominated by the social media question because it's what people see. But as you say, there's so many things that we have now come to depend upon. So the infrastructure of our lives is now fully enmeshed in the internet, and there's really no way to extricate it. And whatever's happening on the major social media platforms, there's so much more happening else. What are the kinds of principles or guidelines we should use when we think about this? It's part of what I would say is defaulting to this underscoring of exactly this problem, which is why are these particular companies and these platforms taking up so much space, right? How is it that we're measuring our views about what companies should and shouldn't do, what people should and should not be allowed to do. Why is it all coming down to whether or not Section 230 applies, right? That is, can we figure out a way to undistort this so that we don't get this kind of overarching domination of the conversation by these companies? Because whatever the answer is to what we should do for Facebook or Google may very well not be the answer that we should have in these other types of contexts. So I guess what I would say is that if we're trying to work out the goal, that is, do we think that what we want is to ensure that sex workers are able to work more safely, right? If that's our goal, let's start there and start working backwards from what it would actually take, and then see what our obstacles are. But I do think that there is a very severe degree to which the oxygen in the room is taken up by, well, what about Google? What about Twitter, et cetera? And that we don't actually get to a lot of those hard questions. But work like yours that actually puts it front and center to say, who does this actually impact the most, right? Do women silence themselves more? Are they made more unsafe by the status quo? Why don't we start there? And even go so far to say, as I've said in other work, we should always be talking about them, right? This is a much overused term now, maybe very misunderstood, but the intersectional kind of question here is find the people in society who are multiply burdened by various forms of discrimination, whether that's gender, whether it's sexual orientation, whether it's their some other aspect of their identity, and think about the experiences for them. How can we design systems for them that will make them less vulnerable and put them at the center of all our conversations?
Your question? Your hand up.
Yeah.
So towards the end of your talk, you talked about, and also in your most recent piece for Yale, you've talked about kind of this task of reimagination and of making meaningful investments in alternative sites, homes of free speech. And I think there's a lot of the rhetoric and propaganda within the decentralized blockchain and cryptocurrency wave kind of is arguing and envisioning themselves as that next world. And then there's also alternatively a lot of venture money flowing into kind of like the next generation of meta filters that you talk about in your piece. And in both cases, those are profit-driven potential solutions that maybe better integrate our societal ethics or morals into this technology and into the actual profit incentives of these companies. I'm curious to hear your response on one, your faith in either of those two paths forward. But two, I would maybe preface it and say, what kind of, call it like, I'm just an undergrad and I'm interested in this kind of just, I don't know why. But I'm curious, what kind of brain trust do you think these kinds of companies need in their back pocket if they want to not only be successful in terms of their bottom line, but if their interests are also driven by their impact and their contribution to the Western world or the world in general?
Well, one short answer to what you're saying, if you're asking how much faith do I have, I guess one thing I'm comfortable saying is I have no faith in crypto. But beyond that, so I think that there's one very one part of it, in response to your question, thinks I'm deeply suspicious of all attempts to throw more technology at technology-created problems. That there seems to be the lesson we should be learning from this is what is it about technological and capitalistic incentives that's driving us off the path, right? So let's back up more. So anytime the answer is let's do more complicated, more technocentric solutions, I just think that can't be right. So I'm cautious about all of those. So I do mention in my Yale piece the metafilter question, and I think metafilter is fascinating because maybe I'm reading too much into what the site was trying to do when it actually did go to the subscription model, but the owner of Metafilter says we did this not because we wanted to make money, but because we didn't want everyone on the site. Sites don't function well when they are in fact open to anyone. Anybody who's ever walked into a truly unstructured environment where there was nobody checking anything at the door knows that that's not a great place to have a conversation. The idea was not that we wanted to make money off of the subscription fee, but to really keep the community smaller. And there are other platforms that are doing this in interesting ways, maybe with maybe more controversial results. If we think about Nextdoor and requiring that you actually have an address in a certain neighborhood, that's a way of trying to keep communities. So I feel like there's something to that way of thinking, which is to think smaller and to try to get people less dependent on technology. I know this is, I'm definitely going to overthink this, but I'm going to bring it a little for at least before with the car at the New York Times. One of the things that was so interesting and refreshing about the phenomenon was that the creator of the game had said, I don't want people to spend a lot of time on this game. I want you to basically have a short amount of time when you play this game and you leave, right? I don't want you to keep working all day. But the point being, the idea that we're going to build in some kind of natural, or at least some kind of, we want to inform you that we want you to use this product. We don't want the product to use you. That's what I think has to be in the center of a lot of these approaches. And then a lot of it comes back to put people in the room that are going to be affected by it most, right? As some people have expressed this as, make your edge cases your symptoms, right? Think about what is this product and its structure going to do for a domestic violence case, right? What is your product and structure going to do for someone who's experiencing racial harassment? Think through those cases and build them into the design. Some of you have heard this universal design idea that you really try to structure your products and services and buildings for people who are most vulnerable, not just because that's the just thing to do, but because you get better products. So I think that's maybe again a very partial response, but that's where I tend to land when thinking about questions like you just posed.
I think it's a great question, and I'm just going to take like a host privilege and also say that to be like, we want these tech companies and like we're thinking about the brain trust, like how are we going to end up with people who are thinking about universal design, people who are thinking about the impacts on, those who are most impacted, by some of these things. It also means people who have a humanities or social science background in the room when these things are being designed, not just coming to fix the problems later. That's like one very functional way to do that.
Yes, and in the deep sense of ethical questions around not just what are your legal obligations here, but also what are your obligations of unintended consequences. Do not retreat into this idea that I didn't mean to do that becomes an excuse for I have no responsibility to fix this now. But get people in the room whose job it is and whose skill set it is to think about what are the unintended consequences of this product, and to think. This is really trying to get away from the techno-determinism of so much of these conversations. Should this product exist at all has got to be a question that everyone in the room is willing to seriously contemplate. Someone should have been in the room to tell Mark Zuckerberg, do not, for the love of God, turn on live streaming, unless you want to ruin us all, right? Someone should have been there to say that. And maybe they were, and you just didn't pay any attention, but someone needs to be talking about the possibility that just because you thought of it doesn't mean you should do it.
Thanks. Thank you, first of all, very much for the presentation. It really was thought-provoking. I did find myself agreeing both with the diagnosis and with the solution. But I guess what I'm wondering about is this issue of the idea of an affirmative right. I'm a sociologist, right? I tend to study questions of sort of political behavior mostly in authoritarian places like Russia. Right? And two things sort of struck me in what you were saying. First of all, if 60-odd% of people, right, in this country or anywhere else think that they actually do have an affirmative right guaranteed by something as sacrosanct as the Constitution, right, to an audience, right, that can't just be the result of being hoodwinked, right? It's a social reality for them, right? And it reflects, I think, the ways in which social media have become integral, not just to the information that we consume, but actually to the ways that we think about ourselves. They're central to our sense of identity, right? And our sense of self, right? And so if we were to push against that, right, and say, no, in fact, we don't have this right, that's a difficult hill to climb, right? I would think. And would we not? What I'm wondering is there a good reason not, in fact, to let First Amendment law evolve in the direction of an affirmative right to an audience, such that A, it would be seen as generally sort of legitimate in the eyes of the 60-odd%? Would you already think they have that right? but would also allow that to then come in for the kinds of limitations that we already place on protected speech, right? That we already have limitations, as you were saying, in place for public order, public safety, and other things.
Should we? No. And the reason I say no is because you're right to say that there's obviously something deep and meaningful about it. If you've got that many people who think this and think it's so deep, and we shouldn't just know that. And totally agree with you there. There tends to be a lot of kind of smugness about the idea of, well, you just don't understand the First Amendment. Well, if the majority of people don't understand the First Amendment, well, then maybe it's the First Amendment that has a problem. You're absolutely, and I am a big believer in rethinking the First Amendment because I should back up and say, no, the First Amendment is getting rethought every day. Every time the Supreme Court comes down on their decision, you know, most people who are tracking the First Amendment are saying, where did that come from? This never happened before. So the idea that it's somehow static and it can never change, that seems wrong. So should we be open to the possibility of it changing? I think yes, but not in the way that you're suggesting. Because I think of all the ways that we could modify the First Amendment, that would be the least beneficial. And I say that because this notion of an affirmative right to an audience, I guess there's a part of me that, this is going to sound smug, is going to say constitutional rights should not be therapy, right? The desire that people have to be seen, to be validated, to feel like their opinion is important, these are incredibly important things. But they're not matters of constitutional significance, I would suggest. Or at least, they're not matters of constitutional significance that should outpace where we are right now, which is so many people who cannot speak freely because they might die, because they might lose their reputation, their businesses, everything they care about. If we're going to start thinking about the deficiencies of the First Amendment law, which I spend a lot of time thinking about, I want us to address that first. And the problem with what you're suggesting, in my view, is those two things would actually be in tension with each other. It is precisely because people think they have an affirmative right to an audience. So for instance, the neo-Nazis who think they have a right to an audience in Turkey, right? It's that kind of thinking that forces the First Amendment to accommodate the worst people and makes everybody else have to just deferential to what they want. Now, of course, it doesn't have to be like that. Perfectly good people who want the right to an audience, but it doesn't tend to work out like that. So I think that they would be too much in tension with each other. And I actually do firmly believe, and this is the teacher in me speaking, that people should want to be better. They shouldn't always want to be welcomed where they are. We shouldn't feel, okay, I didn't get into that class, I didn't get into that school, I didn't get into that club, and think, why didn't they just accommodate me where I was? We should think I should try harder and be better, right? Now, of course, 100 caveats to that, because there are all kinds of factors that make it an uneven playing field that we should always be open to. But the notion that, for instance, as I say to my First Amendment students sometimes, I say, would this be a better or worse class if I had no regulations about who could come into this class? Anybody off the street could just come into this class right now. Doesn't have to have done the reading, doesn't even have to know what we're talking about, and can use all the racial slurs and misogynistic, invective they want. Would that be a good conversation? And pretty much everybody says no, you'd never be able to learn anything. So I'd like to really inculcate this idea of not that you have the right to an audience, but you have the right to try to earn an audience. And that's a wonderful thing. We will try to get you there, be interesting, be valuable, be contributing to society, but not necessarily feel like where you are, wherever it is, that you are necessarily valuable or have something valuable to say, because you might not, or at least not within sort of.
I have one question that I'll read right now from our email, and it's from one of our senior researchers at CTAT, Trexie McMillan-Cottom. Hi, Trexie. Who says, Marianne, thank you for your talk. She's really interested in your comment about expanding non-corporate media ecosystems like libraries and universities. Given CTAT's location in a university and our relationship with the information school, I think a lot about how public institutions like ours are also deeply networked in the same platforms that we are thought to be in competition with. We have a learning management systems and we are a Microsoft campus. Are there any legal or constitutional tools to address this hollowing out of public institutions from the inside?
Oh, what a terrific question. I mean, because this is one of those tricky questions where I'm so in keeping with the spirit of that question, and I don't know if there is any good answer, because where we really have gotten to is the idea that all of our resources, our attention resources and our actual resources are going away from these kinds of public these things that actually provide public and open benefits. So is there a way to make a legal kind of claim to this? I mean, I have tried in really, I guess, really unformed ways to think about how we really need, and I come back to this a lot, the idea that the Equal Protection Clause needs to be more than it does right now, that it needs to provide some kind of affirmative substantive rights. And this is the civil rights notion altogether, right? Which is, it's not just about sort of equality of access in some kind of formal sense. It's about what actually happens when you can see that resources are being diverted to people with more power, privilege, and weak. And I would really like to see a much more aggressive embrace of the notion of equal protection, meaning something like that meaningful access, meaningful allocation of resources. I guess I'm thinking pragmatically about the court as it is. I'm thinking that nothing seems very likely, but maybe we can also.
Another question. Speaking of that pragmatic kind of bend, and thinking about kind of congressional imagination right now, obviously a lot of these changes, at least at the federal level, would not probably come from the court system given like, but, and I think, you know, the kind of antitrust legislation against big tech or the rhetoric of like taking on big tech has become increasingly popular in the wake of excluding reforms to Section 230, which you've been, you know, clearly very vocal about. What would you say of like kind of the proposals that are on the table right now, or if you could like advise a group of senators or Congress people on legislation that would address some of these issues would be kind of the most pressing things?
So the qualifications you said they're not Section 230 reforms.
Yeah, just because I think that one, I mean, speaking frankly, I just don't think that's very likely given the kind of makeup of Congress either. But outside of that, I think there are a lot of like current legislation that are like incremental antitrust approaches or like algorithmic transparency.
Yes, and again, I'm gonna be very disappointed. My answer to you would say it's still Section 230, and these things I don't think they can actually be taken apart. That is, and I'm not an antitrust person, so part of what I'm answering just because I don't have confidence to speak about the antitrust questions, but also because they're not unrelated. That is, how did we get the monopolies we got today? Partly because these companies don't get sued. Right? It's obviously more complicated than that, but what will happen when you tell an entire industry, right? Whoever the people who are already here making money, all of you guys, you're never going to get sued for the harm that you cause. So go nuts, right? The reason why Facebook is as big as it is, the reason why Twitter is as big as it is because it has never had to reallocate its own incentives and say, we're actually going to have to spend resources on defending ourselves in lawsuits. And let us not forget, lawsuits are one of the most important ways that we find out things, right? Companies don't want to tell us stuff, right? What was Frances Haugen telling us over and over again? Nobody knows what goes on at Facebook except Facebook. And the only way to really break that sort of thing open is by letting people sue. I shouldn't say only. One of the only ways that we can get that kind of information is by suing. I'm not saying that just because I'm a lawyer. I'm saying it because if there really is, you know, this is something that I've said in other work that Section 230 is basically tort reform for the internet, right? It's keeping people from getting justice and their day in court because we're deferring to corporations as if they were the victims. Who do you need to look out for? Don't hurt Facebook, right? Or don't hurt these other corporations, as opposed to what about the person who's injured who is facing a closed courtroom door. So my feeling is you change the first Section 230 that is a preemptive immunity, you get more lawsuits, and then you start draining their resources because they won't have all that money to spend on, you know, just dominating our social consciousness. They would actually have to spend on other things. You wouldn't get monopolies. That's one. All the other things that I think I'm sympathetic to, which is accountability, transparency, I love all of those things. My question is, what's the enforcement mechanism? How are you going to make any of these companies give up that information? Other than what they'll tell you, oh, we will do it. Facebook is begging for it now, right? They're saying, oh, regulate us. We will give you all kinds of transparency now, right? We should never trust these companies to give us what we want. We really need to leave it in the hands of people who have been harmed, who are able to show that they have been harmed, to demand some information about how their company works and see whether or not they can actually recover on those bases. So I'm not trying to say there's a silver bullet here, there's not, and you're absolutely right. Pragmatic realities being what they are. Are we going to get Section 230 reform that is intelligent and good? But so long as we're pretending that that's possible in democracy, then I think that's what we need to be focused on, because I don't see how you get around that massive problem of incentives. As long as these companies know they don't ever have to be called to account for their reckless behavior, what possible incentive do they have to comply with any kind of regulation? And how is antitrust ever going to chase down the beast once these companies have become just so big that it doesn't matter how much you find them or you try to reorganize them?
Question? I have one I wanted to ask you. So I'm a communications scholar. So I'm interested in communication. So I was really interested in your thinking, you know, when you're talking about how the tech industry has sort of like colonized our public imagination of like what free speech is, obviously for their benefit. And you talked about like the role the courts have played in that, you know, as well. But I'd be curious to hear, like, from your perspective, where are the other places that we should be looking at, or who has played a role in shaping that public imagination, rather limited and capitalistic imagination of what free speech is and what it's for?
Where should we be? I do think universities are a good place to start. And I think about the university as a model in part because, maybe going a little bit back to your question, which is what are the kinds of things we want to encourage people to, what are the norms and the kinds of standards we want them to internalize? And university norms, however imperfect they may be in practice, university norms of you're here to learn something. You are not here to be told you are perfect just the way you are and you don't need to know anything else. You start at this position of, I am a curious person who wants to know more things. And the answer is, here's a way to give you the path towards learning more things. That's wonderful. I really like that idea. The other idea I thought of, but it's going to sound incredibly bougie because it is the notion of the European salon, right? That this is one of the rare times where the public square in some ways was made real, but it was mostly led by women in their homes, right? So if you think about the French salon where ladies who had certain privileges in society were able to bring intellectuals, artists, politicians together and talk about things in a safe and civilized environment. And I say that because it was actually very important for the saloniers to lay down these rules of these are the kinds of, these are, you have to be respectful of everyone who's here. And they're going to open up their home to these people so that they can have this kind of conversation in what is a secure space to have this conversation. And that ideas were what we were going to analyze as opposed to attacking individuals. Those norms are wonderful. So I think, I don't know what we would say the modern day equivalent of that could be or should be, but those are some models that I think sound right in terms of the overall structure of what it is we would want to do. If we were thinking in terms of how do you lay the groundwork for people to find out for themselves what it means to feel free to speak. That is, what are the necessary preconditions for people to feel that they can speak freely, and let's start from there.
Other questions? Yeah.
Tammy, was your question about how did we get to this free speech, like, narrative, essentially? Like, I'm trying to, I mean, I think Marian's first talk was so good on calling out, frankly, parts of the legal community even who just have fallen in love with the marketplace of ideas as a you know, the theoretical basis for free speech, right? And it is such a great narrative. It has a romantic tale to it. But it does come right at the cost that Marian has talked about. I think to some extent there's places to look, but why do 65% of people think that, right? I mean, because you read the opinions and our First Amendment jurisprudence from like, especially the 20s and the 30s. I mean, those of us who study this are like, oh, this is so wonderful, right? And let's watch the language is gorgeous and the ideas really speaking to the spirit of free speech that I think we all, you know, so desperately need and want in our lives, but then the practical, what I'm told is very good to describe it. Yeah, I don't know. I'm just thinking who's responsible.
Yeah,
Right.
and I'll just say quickly, even to your idea of universities as well. Before I worked at UNC, I was a professor at the University of Utah, and I had some high school students email me and ask me, they were doing a documentary for like a C-SPAN competition, and they wanted to do one on the marketplace of ideas. And could I talk to them about it? And I said, yes. And the first thing they're like, what's wrong with it? And how's it this? And I was like, it's actually bad. You know, like this is like, I said it nicer, but like, here's how we can explain. But like, these were like 16-year-olds.
Yeah.
Obviously, like very motivated 16-year-olds who were like trying to do this C-SPAN documentary, but like, this happens early in our lives, this sort of thinking of it. So just to add that to your.
Well, I want to maybe apologize too, because if I misunderstood your question, were you asking how do we get to the bad state of affairs as opposed to models getting out of it?
I think both. I'm interested in both.
Okay.
I mean, I like laying blame, but I also want to move forward.
Yes, and now we're living in a particularly dangerous moment because to connect up this university question with, it's not a coincidence that we're also living in a moment where there's an attack on universities, there's an attack on education, right? That we're looking at actual book bans, right? That are coming from the government, coming from school boards. That there is this aggressive, hostility towards the idea of a common and public education. I think that tells us a lot about what is wrong with the political makeup of our current moment and why that's so dangerous. And that as much as we think that it's important to figure out what Twitter's rule should be about banning people, we need to be thinking about, well, why are any of us comfortable, and I'm not saying we all in this room are, but why would anybody be comfortable or supportive of government's attempts to actually interfere with schools and say, there are certain subjects you are not allowed to ever teach. There are accurate history you're not allowed to teach, right? Certain books are so emotionally upsetting that you shouldn't have to confront them, right? Coming from many of the same people who just a few years ago were criticizing everything that safe spaces and true. Those very same people saying, to be frank, white children's emotions should determine what the curriculum of a school should be. That's a really dangerous end.
Yeah, last question.
How do you see Section 230 reforms, kind of sort of what you were talking about, like the tort reform models are also in them called like duty of care standard. How do you think they should take into account platform size so that it doesn't disproportionately hurt small platforms?
So I think the best answer is actually to not take it that much into account. That is, you hear this, what I'm nervous about is that so many of the really big dominant companies bring this up all the time. And you think, you don't care, actually, right? Why are you saying that you're worried about Section 230 reform for smaller companies? And I'm going to say that for two reasons. One is if you have a smart standard of reform, that is, I'll just take the one that I like because I wrote it, that if you were to say Section 230 should be conditioned on not exhibiting deliberate indifference to unlawful content, for instance. Deliberate indifference is one of those standards that scales itself, in other words, right? If you are a massive company with billions of pieces of content, the fact that you didn't look at a particular complaint within 24 hours is not deliberate. That'll be fairly obvious once we start applying those standards. So apply a smart standard that can actually take into effect these things at scale and not try to target things so much because you don't do that in other industries, right? Imagine a car manufacturer who says, I'm just a tiny little up and coming car manufacturer. I would rather not spend any money on seatbelts because I really want to break into this market. We wouldn't say, oh, we definitely want those up and coming small companies to have different standards. We would say there's certain standards you're just going to have to abide by. And I mention that in part because some of the most destructive platforms out there aren't the big name platforms, right? The 4chans and the 8chans of the world are not big companies. They're doing a lot of damage. So I think my advice would be to make sure that Section 230 reform is keyed towards a really defensible principle that could scale, which is if you know about something it's foreseeable harm that you chose to take no steps to address, you should not get preemptive immunity. And that should be true no matter how big or small you are.
Great. Well, please join me in thanking Marianne for being here.
One more small book plug.
Oh, yeah. And now I've lost the name of it. Your new book is Fearless Speech. Fearless Speech is coming out later this year.
Well, we'll see.
Later this year. It's been a panini. And we really look forward to it. We'll just have to have you back again to talk about that. And again, you can check our website, ttap.unc.edu for future speakers coming up in the series. And